like to tell you a story. February 2009, warm vanilla candle vapor tickled my nose as I sat in my counselor's office. Avoiding her gaze as she waited for me to say something. A month prior, I had started attending counseling sessions because suicidal thoughts had escalated from fleeting images to sleepless nights. I was thankful that my university supplied me with free counseling sessions. However, the whole idea of talking about my problems with a stranger seemed as laughable as writing about my woes in my angst-filled live journal that I had when I was a misunderstood teenager. My counselor made it known that I was the first gay man she had ever had the opportunity to counsel, so in a way it was as much a new experience for her as it was for me. Hesitantly, as I went into my next counseling session, I clutched the crinkled edges of the poem I had written the night before. The paper quivered with the rhythm of my own anxiety as I felt ashamed of its contents. During the last session, I mentioned that I had a difficult time articulating my depression and anxiety because I didn't know when it was right or wrong to discuss it. In a prior session, I told her that I loved to write poems, and she persuaded me to articulate my problems through that outlet. She nodded and encouraged me to read it aloud, and I did. Each confessional word fell for me like ice chunks breaking from glaciers as I revealed my battle with depression, the criticism I received for being a male expressing emotions, and the most difficult revelation of all, the fact that I was sexually assaulted. I always told myself that acknowledging my violation was enough. Little did I know that writing a poem about this event helped me heal more than I would have ever imagined. In essence, by placing it on paper, I transformed that socially unacceptable pain into power, into something solid. When I was a teenager, I'd read stories on the internet of men suffering sexual assault but finding no closure or justice. After all, according to many, it was and still is considered a crime only against women. Despite the counseling, I still told myself that I was dirty, worthless, and damaged goods. I blamed every failed relationship and date on the fact that I wasn't good enough because of this specific experience. Over the years, I gradually numbed myself and I tried to forget. After all, that's what real men do, right? They buck up and they bury their emotions. Burying emotions became a reflex for me. I had a lot of practice burying, starting on the elementary school playground when I would bite my lip to hold back tears after bullies harassed me. This eventually translated into college. I avoided any conversation about feelings after one of my former female friends told me, quote, "Well, Mr. Sensitivity, you've become more high maintenance than any man I've ever met, gay or straight." End quote. To her, I wasn't manly enough and was even told that I should hang out with other men and do manly things and learn how to bury my emotions more effectively. And after that exchange, I began talking to myself during third shifts at my desk job because I was too afraid to talk to friends about a numbness that I was feeling. And after this moment, I realized that telling anybody about my trauma beyond my counselor was an impossibility. Sensitive men expressing traumatic stories are deemed socially unacceptable because it doesn't fall within their traditional gender binary role. I didn't open up my eyes to the severity of my experiences until I took an ethnic American literature class during my graduate program. My attention was drawn to two-spirit poets within Native American communities who shared my trauma and bravely told their stories within their poems. Richard LaFortune explains that two spirits contain the presence of both feminine and masculine spirit in one person, an identity I connected with after realizing my own gender fluidity combined with my sexuality. After reading trauma poems by two spirits, Qwo-Li and Deborah Miranda, I realized that the act of storytelling through poetry is transformative and distances the survivor from the trauma. This distancing doesn't ignore the trauma. It allows two spirits to examine the trauma at a distance, accept past events, culminating in the use of poetry as a tool to heal others who've endured similar trauma. Sharing traumatic memory through poetry is medicine. It allows two spirits to transform their sexual trauma into power. Immediately, I realized that the same use of poetry could also assist men in defeating our culture's man-up mentality by showing them that expressing their trauma stories is possible, not taboo. The problem with our culture's man-up mentality is that it creates a toxic environment and discourages men from discussing their trauma stories. The first question that came to me was, where did this toxicity originate? Qwo-Li Driscoll presents the idea that sexuality and gender stereotyping were weapons used by colonizers to overpower and control others. He claims that it is no accident that white masculinity is constructed the way it is in the United States, as European invasion of the Americas required masculinity that murders, rapes, and enslaves Native and African peoples. It is masculinity that requires men to be soldiers and conquerors in every aspect of their lives. A masculinity rooted in genocide essentially breeds a culture of sexual abuse. Our culture built on colonization, whether it is colonizing land or our bodies, disguises trauma by validating personal invasion as a feat of masculine power. The toxicity makes it difficult for men to tell their trauma stories because expression is labeled feminine, therefore something to be conquered. While this inhibits all men from telling their stories and healing, gay men particularly suffer from the colonizing qualities of the gender binary, since we're continually struggling to fit in within the socially acceptable comfort zone between both extremes. So in many ways, it's socially unacceptable for us to be feminine as it defies the traditional gender role. The similar damage that's being done to women is also occurring to men. The only difference is that one is discussed while the other one is considered too taboo to discuss. Men are not believed when they say that I am a survivor of rape. Ignoring the survival stories of men silences them into internalizing their trauma, which leads to, as Driscoll observes in the Two-Spirit community, as people committing suicide or turning to drugs and alcohol to cope with the colonization of our sexuality and genderness. He notices the lack of conversation about trauma Two-Spirit people experience. Men, especially gay men, also face the same non-existence. He goes on to say that we found ourselves despising our bodies and sexualities, unable to speak of our own erotic lives. And we see these dominant cultures' concepts of erotic and know that they have nothing to do with our Two-Spirit bodies, often causing us to dissociate from our own erotic selves or assimilate the dominant culture's concepts into our lives. This dissociation tells us male survivors that we must conform to the stereotype that we should divorce ourselves from telling our trauma stories because we can't be harmed by a crime that can only happen against women. While some conversation about sexual violence against men is initiated through statistics provided by sites like the Human Rights Campaign, few stories are told. Here are some statistics that I found in the Human Rights Campaign about gay and bisexual men who experience sexual assault, and even some statistics for heterosexual men. Ultimately, though, while these statistics are alarming, my questions are, what about the men who are too afraid to share their stories out of fear of not being believed or out of fear of being emasculated? What can help them express themselves in a manner that allows them to confront this trauma and inform critics that their expression is socially acceptable? Storytelling through poetry would allow men to reveal their survival stories, resist the colonizing gender binary, and influence other survivors to also confront their trauma and transform it into healing. Poetry does not reduce our experiences to mere statistics. It allows those experiences to transform into something tangible. It allows us to separate from that oppressive silence. Before men, gay or straight, can accept the medicine of storytelling, we must cultivate an understanding of communities that already tell their trauma stories. Native women, essentially, are a group of people who are discussing their trauma stories. Andrea Smith states in her article, Not an Indian Tradition of Sexual Colonization of Native Peoples, that when a Native woman suffers abuse, this abuse is not just an attack on her identity as a woman, but on her identity as Native. The issues of colonial, race, and gender oppression cannot be separated. This explains why, in my experience as a rape crisis counselor, coming from her perspective, that every Native survivor I ever counseled said to me at one point, I wish I was no longer Indian. The same could be argued for men, particularly gay men, based on my own personal experience, because I have had situations after my own experience where I flat out told myself that I did not want to be gay because to me, this experience made me feel dirty. Okay? The assault was not just an attack on my identity, but it continues in attacks with statements from people who can't grasp the idea that men too can be sexually assaulted. For example, here is a list of a few statements that I have heard not only aimed at myself, but at other gay males that I have encountered who have been sexually assaulted. Quote, "Men cannot be raped," end quote. Well, it was another guy, you didn't like it? Or my favorite of all, which this one just blows me away. "Why didn't you stand up for yourself or defend yourself?" Because I guess being a man means that I'm indestructible and impervious to such invasions. I'm expected that I need to stand up for myself and that I'm physically capable of standing up for myself because I am male. The fact that there's little to no attention given to men who've experienced sexual violence is a part of the problem. If people are not exposed to these stories, they go on believing what they are told, that men can't experience this. Smith goes on to say that in the colonial imagination, Native, and I include gay individuals in this too, Native and gay bodies are imminently polluted with sexual sin because our bodies are dirty. They are considered sexually violatable and rapeable. That is, in patriarchal thinking, only a body that is pure can be violated. The rape of bodies that are considered inherently impure or dirty simply does not count. And many people label our sexualities as impure or sinful, therefore excluded from what our culture believes as pure. This disguises our traumatic experiences as simply being symptoms of our malformed identities, according to these individuals who don't believe us. This brings me to the first two-spirit poet that resonated with me, both with her poetry and her historical research, which investigates storytelling as a form of resistance within California tribes. She argues that storytelling is an indigenous survival strategy against rape, a primary tool of colonization. Deborah Miranda comments that as a survivor herself, she is drawn to these stories and realizes that they engage in a very indigenous practice, that storytelling as testimony, education, community action, and resistance. She claims that survivors must engage in conversation with the survivor, take part in their cure, and take part in our own cure, essentially. This resonated with me because for the first time I realized that expressing my own story would, in a way, continue the conversation that started by other survivors before me. Storytelling allows us to resist that silence that's imposed on us. It gives us form to the formless trauma, therefore disempowering its hold over us. Miranda participates in this collective healing with her poem, Deer, where she graphically connects the image of a deer being skinned and gutted by its hunter to her own sexual assault survival story. She makes the memory solid when she says, "But what I remember are men's hands, the rough way they turn back the hide, jerk down hard, and tear it off her body." She directly connects the hunter's gutting of the deer to her own identity, which was stripped away by the experience. At the end of the poem, she claims that I've been taken like that, without thanks, without a prayer, by hands that didn't touch me the way a gift should be touched. Even though she is recalling a painful event, giving it form as her way of resisting the silence and shame these experiences impose, she takes a piece of that trauma and traps it within the poem, separating it from her body. Transforming trauma into story allows the survivor to reflect on the experience at a distance, allowing not only healing to take place for the survivor, but healing to take place in those who can connect with this experience, like myself. I never realized until reading this poem that I could stop being angstily cryptic in my own poetry and simply be honest with my experiences. It gave me the confidence to carry on the conversation. Coley Driscoll's poem, On Hearing Another Friend Was Raped, is another example where he juxtaposes his assault with another person's trauma. He uses the metaphor of creating a shawl to make a connection with the person he's speaking to. Gradually, he builds a foundation that creates a sense of understanding and acknowledgement between himself and the other survivor when he says, "I wrap your story around my shoulders, let it tangle and knit with mine as defiant gestures of skin, a complex network of roots." Embracing himself with the other person's story and creating a root system of complexity is medicine for him and the survivor. Transforming the trauma into story informs the survivor that they are connected through that healing process. And he goes on to say that your marked net My scratched heart are wounds we permit to fall away, that sing the body into sacred ground where we harvest blooming crops of resistance. Through the shared storytelling, Driscoll states that allowing the wounds to fall away resists the trauma's destructiveness, ultimately transforming it into healing. The poem acts as a healing ceremony. The 4-line stanzas echo the sacredness of the number 4 in Cherokee spirituality, and the references to sacred ground implies that Driscoll views the act of writing this poem as a sacred means of healing. And this brings me to my final example of storytelling medicine acted as a resistance to the shame and silence within survivors. One of my favorite spoken word artists, Mary Lambert, speaks confidently in her poem, in her song poem, Body Love Part 2. She essentially walks fellow survivors through the act of reclaiming their bodies, and she connects her own story to the listener by performing it when she proclaims that fathers and uncles are not claiming your knife anymore, or not your razor. No, put the sharpness back. As survivors, we are still, as she says in her poem, the tree stump that's still breathing after the forest fire. Our limbs are charred, but we're still living. As a survivor myself, being reminded that I'm still breathing, that I'm still existing, helped me realize that my experience robbed me of many things, but not my voice. In a society where it's socially unacceptable for men to express these stories, poetry is a way for us to transform our scars into healing, preserve that healing on paper, and reach out to others by existing as an example that they too do not have to be silent anymore.